God, it's so tremendously on brand for me to talk about a movie when the discourse surrounding it is already dead, but we need to talk about The Matrix Resurrections. Full disclosure, I love The Matrix, and have done ever since the year 2000, when a good friend of mine came around with his copy on DVD, which at the time seemed like a sort of futuristic space disc, and me and my then friend circle sat and watched it together when I would have been about 6 or 7 years old. I'm putting this at the front because I want you to know that everything that follows from this point onwards comes from the perspective of a fanboy. Like, this topic is absolutely my lane. I love rewatching the movies. I love talking about the movies. I love weighing up the strengths and weaknesses of the sequels, all the cross-media stuff they did, and talking about the deeper philosophical stuff that's underpinning the series. So when it comes to this recent outing, Resurrections, coming 18 years after the previous one, has unfortunately failed to perform at the box office, accompanied by mixed to negative reviews and a divided fan base. That is worth discussing in some degree of detail. But before we do, for those who aren't already on board, let's put the thing in some context. The Matrix is a multimedia franchise owned and distributed by Warner Bros., centering on 4 feature films collectively written and directed by Lana and Lily Wachowski, 2 of the dorkiest dorks that have ever dorked. The series is set in a near-future dystopia in which sentient machines dominate the planet and grow human beings as a means to harvest bioelectric and thermal energy to power themselves, whilst keeping human minds enclosed in a collective simulated reality called The Matrix. We follow protagonist Neo, a computer hacker living mostly unaware inside the Matrix as he becomes more conscious of the falseness of his reality, eventually managing to fight his way out and escape with the help of a band of rebels from the real world who believe him to be the One, a prophesied messianic figure said to turn the tide in the machine war, fighting back against the tyrannical system, freeing the rest of humanity. The original film, released in March of 1999, was a smash hit and became a genuine cultural phenomenon. It was, in so many words, a ferociously heady mix of Frank Miller anime Hong Kong style action merged with Jean Baudrillard, Philip K. Dick and cyberpunk style science fiction, essentially a labour of love that fused every single thing that the Wachowskis were into. In 2003, 2 sequels were spawned, Reloaded and Revolutions, each less well received than the previous, though critical re-evaluation weighs them more favourably with the benefit of hindsight. That said, the collection of anime prequel shorts, The Animatrix, was and continues to be acclaimed. The series also spawned dozens of official comics and 3 separate video games. Enter the Matrix, an official tie-in side story set before and during the events of the middle sequels, Path of Neo, essentially a video game adaptation of the series up until that point, and The Matrix Online, a massively multiplayer online role-playing game which actively furthered the stories of the movies post-Revolutions, which lasted until the servers were shut down in 2009. The series' recurring themes are that of the symbiosis between machine and man, the paradox of choice and choicelessness, control versus autonomy, what personal identity means in the digital age, and whether or not it's truly possible to subvert the systems and boundaries that impose definition upon us. Also, and this should never go unstated, there is a whole transgender allegory running beneath the series which once you see, you'll never unsee ever again. It is to this series what Christianity is to The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, or what conversations about World War II are to The Lord of the Rings.
Can't go back, can I?
No. But if you could, would you really want to?
So anyway, with all that in mind, what does this recent instalment have to offer? Well, speaking only for myself, I'd say quite a lot. I mean, it is a very imperfect film in a lot of respects. The movie suffers from a certain amount of what you might call production jank, which is a nice way of saying that the action is frequently underwhelming, the dialogue is quite clunky in places, actors frequently make really weird performance decisions, and just like the other sequels, is lacking a certain tidiness that the original film had. But it's not without its merits. Firstly, I admire the fact that the movie has the good sense to not compete with the other 3, because doing so will inevitably lead to disappointment faster, opting to be its own distinct entry rather than actively trying to pick up where it left off in 2003. The original movie was an absolute shot in the arm, the shock of the new, the millennium approaching with a new cinema to herald it in. So trying to recreate that with all the cultural awareness of what The Matrix is, all the memes, derivatives, discourse and art that's been built on top of the series attempting to answer, outdo, or even just mimetically associate itself with it is ultimately fruitless. It's no wonder the film doesn't look or feel like the rest of the series, because in the near 20 years since 2003, so much of the blockbuster landscape has tried to ape it. So much of what The Matrix was has already been reproduced and disseminated. The Matrix revolution, such as it was, is already over, already worn down by a decade of mimetic association. So Resurrections aims to succeed it by doing literally anything else. It trades the drab, grey, oppressive IBM Microsoft-dominated Web 1.0 scene of the original movies in favour of a more bright, contemporary Silicon Valley cafe culture, apps and social media, laptop and smartphone affair. The action sequences are looser and more playful than the tight, rehearsed with an inch-of-its-life Yoon Woo-ping choreography of previous. It trades cool, detached philosophical stoicism for whimsy and heart. It's funnier in a more overtly dorky way than previous, with jokes used to break up the action, and it's not straining with portentousness. Adding to that, it's also a disarmingly sincere film, like achingly so. For all the accusations of it being a cynical cash grab by online pundits, there's a surprising enthusiasm and creative verve on display in spite of an audience response that says it's yet another out of mothballs revival in an industry that is quickly and expensively running out of good ideas. If anything, it feels like an attempt to see if The Matrix as a series still has a place in the 2020s blockbuster scene, given how it's using a similar vocabulary to its contemporaries, with a tone that's very Disney-style light comedy, a colour palette and cinematography more overtly flowery and handheld, allowing for the production to set up shots and move faster, and a use of humour to break up the action, with a cast that's more overtly human and emotive in their performances than was previously the case. It's using the language of the contemporary blockbuster scene as a means to ingratiate itself within the current climate, especially given how its original scene is well and truly over. The decade The Matrix was coming off the back of, the world of Total Recall, Terminator 2, Speed, Bad Boys, GoldenEye, Independence Day, Dark City, The Truman Show and Blade literally doesn't exist anymore. You also have to keep in mind that the rest of the series doesn't quite look or feel like the original film, because The Matrix was basically, what if the two folks who made cool indie erotic thriller Bound got to do a gigantic action movie, and the sequels were produced with the full confidence and backing of a studio that knew it was going to do massive business for them. And as a subversive act, there is something somewhat respectable about a movie in a series as beloved, well-known, and mimetically familiar as The Matrix is, being this deliberately incongruous. A lot of this is down to how Lana Wachowski is, quite simply put, a very different person to whom she was all those years ago. Both the sisters were way in the closet when they made the original trilogy, and given the opportunity to come back, isn't entirely satisfied with merely retreading old ground. It's a more robust film made with the benefit of hindsight. It's a movie that has more in common with the filmmaker who was involved in giant productions like V for Vendetta, Speed Racer, Ninja Assassin, Cloud Atlas, Jupiter Ascending and Sense8 than it does the person who co-wrote and directed Bound. It's far too easy to diagnose the entire project as just another cynical nostalgia cash grab, as many have indeed pegged it as, especially since upon closer inspection it's actually a lot more thoughtfully constructed than you may initially realise. And before we proceed any further, I want you to know that it is totally okay if you're simply not vibing with what the movie has to offer at all. Your sense of taste is your sense of taste, and there's no sense in me arguing that your personal preferences are wrong. Plus, the movie does have problems, as previously mentioned, none of which, by the way, are particularly new to this particular series or this particular filmmaker, taking into account her larger body of work. But what you can't argue about the film is that it's lazy and cynical, because the movie is simply too deliberate and purposeful to be uninteresting, and there's clearly enough effort on display here to not warrant that type of easy diagnosis. Like, the filmmakers have actually tried really hard to create something more nuanced and interesting for you to unpack and grapple with here. To put it in absolute terms, I simply refuse to believe that the movie isn't good because of lack of care, because the Wachowskis are nothing if not tryhards. It's like their main thing as storytellers. Admittedly, the circumstances of its existence are less than auspicious, and the movie knows it. Pretty much ever since the trilogy wrapped in 2003, Warner had been bugging the sisters to make another one, and the pair had always turned them down because their interests were generally elsewhere. V for Vendetta, Ninja Assassin, Cloud Atlas and all that. But then there were rumblings around 2017 that Warner had hired X-Men 3 and Ready Player One screenwriter Zach Penn to write a prequel project with a young Morpheus as the central character, with Michael B. Jordan allegedly in talks to play the lead. These plans eventually fell through, but the writing was on the wall. Warner Brothers were going to move forward with the series whether or not the Wachowskis were here for it or not. And after their parents passed away, Lana's priorities realigned and wrote a bunch of new material which turns into a fourth movie. Lily, though, decides to peace out of all things Matrix because of personal reasons, but regardless, here we are with this movie. If The Matrix was allegedly, according to Grant Morrison, inspired by The Invisibles, then Resurrection seems to have more in common with something like The Filth, which is to say it's a standalone tale partially about the previous works, about the revolution in retrospect, and whether or not anything truly changed. In that respect, it makes a certain amount of sense that the movie's primary fascination is that of loops and repetition, Neo's modal being a simulation that repeats as a means of evolving programs, with a programmed version of Trinity named Echo, imagery of treadmills or characters jogging in place. Neo is rescued by bugs and brought aboard the Nemesis, named for the Greek god of memory. Neo suffers through endless brainstorming meetings where characters repeat the same handful of phrases over and over without getting any closer to what they're trying to recapture. Neo being made to revisit the events of his life story within the Matrix and feeling lesser in comparison. In fact, the spectre of Neo's life looms large over the world of this story in both a thematic and literal way, as new scenes often contain one-to-one references to the original, and as old sequences are replayed during new sequences. Characters from the old series are even brought back explicitly to commentate on the changes as the new plays out before them. There's also a visual motif of mirrors. Characters are depicted with alternate reflections or make discoveries by looking into mirrors, and of course, phones have now been replaced by windows and mirrors as a way of jacking out as characters go through the looking glass. What the movie's concerned with are the cycles that we find ourselves trapped in. Not that repetition is itself inherently bad, but that it is by its very nature limiting and reductive. The comforting expectation of that repetition, the comforting sense of direction and focus, men on a chessboard telling you where to go. Characters even take actions that repeat or mirror actions in the previous movies, whilst also being aware that it is a reference, letting you know that it's just as tied with the expectation and obligation as you presumably are. Lana Wachowski supposedly brought Neo and Trinity back as a means of self-comfort after her parents passed away, but she's also not entirely satisfied as to not question the nature of that comfort. There's a great interview where Lana passes some of this out in regard to the concept of retreading old ground, or as she puts it, againness, and how we tend to repeat things because we find them comforting or because we want to measure or track development across time. You know, like when you measure your height against a door frame, or exercise, or indeed any small routines we do specifically because that againness is never truly again. Fiction is seemingly infinite. It can do anything. It can bring back dead characters purely because the writer says so, or it can just change reality just because, and yet here we are doing the same old stuff over and over and over. Smith even points out exactly this to justify rebooting The Matrix as a franchise, that we've been telling similar stories for literal centuries, that stories don't ever really end, and that all that really changes are names and faces, if you want to get Carl Jung, Joseph Campbell, Jordan Peterson about it. I mean, staying within the broader work of the Wachowskis here, they did literally make an entire movie demonstrating exactly that, the eternal recurrence of themes and struggles across various time periods and genres. Cloud Atlas is in large part about that againness. The way that Lana conceptualizes this fourth installment is, in her own words, not as a fourth rectangle in a series of like rectangles, but rather a bespoke rectangle that encompasses all previous rectangles. So it makes some sense that Resurrection certainly rhymes with the original series whilst also being its own distinct thing, and doesn't concern itself with recapturing the cultural moment it once existed within. I mean, for starters, the movie somewhat loosely follows the beats and rhythms of the 1999 movie whilst pointedly changing things along the way. There's a prologue with a female runner trying to escape agents, but with a twist. Neo finds himself as yet another stuck in his life office drone, loosely aware of the phoniness of his existence, but with a twist. He's given the opportunity to leave by a wise and sage figure, but with a twist. He manages to escape and finds himself amongst a group of rebels fighting the Resistance, but with a twist. He travels back into the Matrix to rescue a captured member of the Resistance, but with a twist. And the whole thing culminates in a set-piece finale where Neo takes a leap of faith on himself, which empowers him to achieve his goals, but with a twist. Now, this type of self-referential rhyming storytelling is nothing new to anyone who's seen The Force Awakens, or indeed any other legacy sequels of a similar template. What matters here is the confluence of changes and similarities taken on the whole, how the againness isn't truly again. What's of note is that whilst the aesthetic and decorum the story takes place in has changed, the underlying systemic issues within the Matrix itself remain the same, the diminishment and reduction of humanity to an exploitable resource. Whilst the vector through which it happens has changed, the reduction of human lives to batteries remains constant. And of course, this is alongside the deeper concern that the Matrix, as a creation by the Wachowskis ostensibly designed as a freeing and enlightening work, has now become its own exploitable resource. Intellectual property owned by Warner Brothers that has emotional and spiritual meaning to a large audience. It kind of works in tandem with the series' overall themes regarding the paradox of choice and choicelessness, how we are both free to act but are nonetheless informed and controlled by the systems and frameworks we exist within. Here it's more so about the legacy of those frameworks, the legacy of those cycles, the again but improved, and whether or not it's truly possible to effect a real revolution of them. Keanu Reeves' best acting moment in the entire film is when Neo considers whether or not the One really did do anything meaningful, because the system he sought to destroy still exists long after the Machine War, and still imprisons humankind against their will to source as a means of power. The difference is that even the machines are rebelling against the system now, something we only saw hints of in the previous movies, and so that challenges us to see the true enemy with more nuance than just artificial intelligence itself. The common enemy is the underlying systems that govern both us and them.
That's how the Resistance are able to build a better Zion in the form of Io, and it's why Smith ends up becoming an ally in the end, because there is room for collaboration across different perspectives that all wish to be free of the boundaries and frameworks we're caught in.
What if a program didn't want to exist as just a tool? Just as what if a human didn't want to be an obedient and compliant worker?
It kind of makes the very meta argument that for things to truly progress in this universe, by which I mean both our world and the world of the Matrix itself, things would have to radically shift. Like, it wants to recommit to that expansive, enlightening, radical intent of the original trilogy, and in a world of nostalgia cash grabs and legacy sequels where nostalgia and cheap pops are the new emotional currency, that is quite a notable and admirable thing.
One very enlightening aspect of the movie's themes comes from the use of the quote, "It is so much simpler to bury reality than it is to dispose of dreams," taken from Don DeLillo's novel Americana, which is a critique of American society in specific, but is in part about cinema's remarkable power to misrepresent and distort reality. It's easier and more efficient for the system to get the populace to ignore their own pain and suffering than it is to override or remove their want for change. In fact, they actively benefit by not removing that yearning, but by actively exploiting it, by providing the again, but with improvements.
Did you know hope and despair are nearly identical in code?
As per the analyst, the system now more effectively exploits what people believe than exploits their reality, the yearning for systemic change, the eternal reaching out for a better world, only an arm's length away if we could only just grasp it without possibly losing what we already have. It's an illusion, the stick is theirs and they are holding it. It's the same illusion as with the two pills. Given a choice between freedom and subjugation, you already know what the right thing is to do, and so the Matrix opts to bury reality by utilising our dreams.
That's why in the Matrix 4 meetings the team insists on developing a new bullet time as a potential new means of control, because without careful consideration, revolutions can create new opportunities for exploitation.
The commodification of Neo's story by the system is essentially a type of interpassivity, where fiction acts on behalf of the audience. As a means of diminishing agency, the analyst needs Neo's story of rebellion and triumph over tyranny to be an empty spectacle for an audience to enjoy, precisely because it encourages passivity. It encourages the audience to watch and enjoy someone else rebel and destroy the system, sharing catharsis and victory with the characters on screen, even whilst the audience hasn't actually done anything. The audience becomes spectators, narrowly defined by watching as the world they exist within remains unchanged, satisfying the need for change without changing the very thing that really needs changing. As Mark Fisher puts it in his excellent book Capitalist Realism, the film performs our anti-capitalism for us, allowing us to continue to consume with impunity. And this is how the Matrix is able to effectively exploit the yearning for revolution without being able to entirely remove it. With less human minds around for farming post-Machine War, the solution is to maximise the output of the limited minds they do have, and that means emotional exploitation. This is especially notable given how so much of the rest of the series is about the power of belief and self-determination, with the flexibility of reality being partially tied into that. Neo's character journey across the series starts off with affirmation of his skepticism of the world being well-founded, and with a new confidence in being the one to turn the tide in the war to liberate mankind. But then we get to Reloaded, and it turns out that the source code that Neo carries, which allows him to undermine the system, is fully accounted for, and that different rebels that possess the very same source code have escaped the Matrix and been destroyed 5 previous times, essentially making a mockery of Chosen One narratives and how manipulable people are when they believe that they are the great man of history. All the undermining of the system is taken into account because the system has gotten very good at accurately predicting what the anomaly is going to do, in the same way that we're all very familiar with Joseph Campbell-style heroes' journeys and the tropes contained within that. Againness, but as a weapon wielded by the machines. And so with his sense of destiny thoroughly shaken, the revolution in Revolutions is about Neo rejecting his calling as the Chosen One, rejecting his search to be told what to do, and getting his friends to trust him as a person as he self-actualizes in participating his own role.
You've never believed in the One.
I still don't.
Then why are you doing this?
I believe in him.
Why, Mr. Anderson? Why? Why do you persist?
Because I choose to.
Ironically, in allowing himself to be sacrificed by the machines to destroy Smith, he fulfills the prophecy and becomes deified as an icon, the againness of Christian imagery. And then in his next life, he discovers that his story, his Christ-like journey, has been trivialized as a video game with no deeper meaning, not unlike how the dead are pulped and fed intravenously to the living. Yeah, he created peace between the machines and humankind, but it was all just memes, you see. If all The Matrix ever was just memes and content, then that means that Warner Brothers can more effectively sell it to you because they determine the parameters within which you engage with their property, as consumers who buy product and get excited for next product with no thoughts or souls, living in a soulless universe of dead matter. As Bugs says, if we don't know what's real, we can't resist.
Within leftist circles, the term recuperation is already a familiar one, which for everyone else is basically when capital absorbs something that was originally intended to be critical of its framework, literally digesting it and passing it out in a less harmful form. The again, but with improvements.
A somewhat relatively contemporary political example of this is the conservative view of Martin Luther King, who they've attempted to repackage as a genteel, polite spokesman who calmly and rationally explained why black people deserve rights, and then the white establishment decided to go, yeah, sure, because he was just so nice. More often than not utilised to demoralise Black Lives Matter protesters who are angry and shouty and just not being patient and rational like the man in the picture that they have painted for you. This is a fabrication, of course, in stark contrast to the radical political activist that King actually was, who frequently intentionally broke the law and whose ideas were just as controversial then as they are now. He was despised by Republicans and Democrats alike in much the same way that BLM are now. By the way, I'm not trying to compare MLK to a fictional action movie character here. I'm just trying to illustrate the very real way in which systems can digest and transmogrify criticism into something more pleasing or useful for their purposes, typically by stripping away the original context or intended meaning. Neo's life story is very much his own. His actions were and are his to take, but the way in which it's been repackaged into a product or content trivializes the radicalism of the original films and defangs the series of most of what it aims to teach us. That this man who defies the rules and boundaries of the system, who helped liberate humanity and broker peace between us and the machines, was a fiction created by a company owned by Warner Brothers. Which, you know, it is.
That's what the Matrix does. It weaponizes every idea, every dream, everything that's important to us.
This isn't a particularly new idea to this series either, it's just a logical extrapolation from this midway scene from the first film.
I have these memories from my life. None of them happened. What does that mean?
But the Matrix cannot tell you who you are.
This is where the residual self-image stuff comes in too. In a world in which meaning can often be malleable and imposed by consensus, to what extent is your identity truly yours? And what if one were to lose the ability to self-define in your own eyes? Would it be possible to get it back? If you fictionalize the truth, does it become less real? If your only sense of self is through memory, then is that not a fiction? That's the danger of becoming iconic, of becoming a symbol, because your life becomes an object whose meaning is eternally mutable by consensus. Neo, Thomas Anderson, intellectually knows that on some level his life as Neo is real and means something, in spite of being controlled by a system in a world insisting that it's all just memes and content for a best-selling video game.
This also folds into the transgender allegory that I mentioned earlier. Trans non-binary people are very often interrogated by society because their identities are seen as dubious or suspect, lesser because of not conforming to the gender expectations that society insists that they stick to. It's a society-wide attempt at defining gender non-conforming people out of their right to self-determination.
Not to mention, Neo's in therapy, overseen personally by the analyst, and is being intentionally denied the care that he really needs, the means to empower himself, because the ability to self-define and self-determine is anathema to the needs of the system, which are to keep him subdued for use as a battery. And so he is told how to interpret what's happening to him in a way that keeps him locked in the system, once again being led down a path of control that removes his own agency.
I pay my analyst a lot of money to answer such questions for me.
To bring it home, this is the reason why the choice of the two pills is an illusion, because there's no circumstances in which the analyst would actually offer Neo his own liberation. He lives inside the Matrix, he has no choices, he cannot help but be subjugated by the machines. It's a great extrapolation of this scene from Reloaded.
Everything begins with choice.
No, wrong. Choice is an illusion created between those with power and those without.
This aspect is mirrored in Trinity's plot also. She identifies with her former self, presented to her as a fiction, and although several years removed, she wishes she could be that person, seeing herself reflected within that fiction, just like how the rebels saw themselves in her. The irony being that it actually is her, but she's being kept in place and gaslit by the Matrix into fulfilling her rigidly defined role as a mother of 2 children and a loving wife. The Matrix mocks Trinity for wanting to be who she was, ensuring that she internalizes that her time has passed and that she enjoys her gilded cage. In a number of ways, Resurrections often feels like it wants to be about the series' fight to mean something in the face of anti-intellectualism, to have the final say on what the Matrix is in the face of competing modes of interpretation, the various forces that wish to co-opt the Matrix for their own ends, counter to how it was originally intended. Most telling is that when Neo has to sit through the board meeting with people trying to recapture what they think the Matrix even was, all they have to demonstrate in terms of their understanding is a big handful of memes, their interpretation of what the movies were doing and the various ways they can move it into louder, dumber directions. The again, but with improvements.
I like my games big, loud, and dumb.
We need guns. Lots of guns. Matrix means mayhem.
The irony being that they are all essentially correct in their own way, because art is malleable and transformative in that interpretive way, but the way that they're going about it is just so hugely reductive. Not to mention, the entirety of the analyst's plan is to use the anomaly and the code it carries as a means of solving their energy crisis, spending years and years trying to figure out what makes the one tick and how best to maximize its output, essentially being a meta-commentary on Warner Bros.' intention to continue the series without the sisters, which in a way is not unlike actually keeping Neo and Trinity trapped, tortured, and jogging in place forever. It's a fundamental tension at the heart of the Matrix as a cultural object, that it caught on with a blockbuster audience that responded to its highly inventive action with its radicalism and philosophy as the chaser. And so, in attempting to expand upon those ideas in subsequent movies to highlight what really mattered, this created a friction with audiences who understandably wanted bigger, more spectacular arrangement of pure action. And just as depicted in Resurrections, the familiar, the againness is pleasant and comfortable, and you have to exude conscious effort to enjoy the change. The revolution, while necessary, is inherently uncomfortable. Without meaning to sound anti-intellectual here, the sisters kind of low-key made the mistake of compressing these intelligent ideas into a mass-market action movie, because when you simplify things too much, people tend to assume that they're simple-minded as opposed to making them accessible to a mass audience, because that depth is and always has been there for discovery, whether or not there's an audience to appreciate it or not. Because the good news is that it is perfectly possible for the system to absorb and assimilate something that it cannot fully digest, a pill of its own that it cannot entirely swallow. I mean, this is low-key what happened with the original movie. Warner Brothers saw a cool action movie script, which they didn't entirely understand, but sought to produce it regardless, because there was something intriguing about it, and its ideas changed cinema in a way that Warner Brothers couldn't have accurately predicted. Capital is so blindly motivated by profit that they will sell you the means with which you could possibly destroy them. You can buy copies of Das Kapital on Amazon. All of Rage Against the Machine's music is available on iTunes and Spotify. The Guy Fawkes masks that Warner Brothers were selling as V for Vendetta merchandise were the very same used by Occupy Wall Street protesters and continue to be used by other anti-capitalist groups to this day. They took Neo's life story and they trivialized it as a video game. But the notion that the system can be changed, that it can be altered and subverted, that it's all arbitrary and that we must exude conscious effort in order to do that, is still contained within that, now readily accessible to anyone who knows how to read subtext.
Our memories turned into fiction any less real.
Accumulatively, Lana Wachowski seems quite keenly aware that the mainstream legacy of The Matrix is a mere catalogue of memes with huge franchising potential, contents for exploitation by the hands of its mega corporate owners, and has actively decided that if this whole crazy journey meant anything at all, it's because of the human element, that all of this came from people, which is why the movie is more overtly personal. Lana and Lily Wachowski undeniably put a lot of themselves and their specific interests into the series, and Resurrection stands as Lana's attempt to liberate the characters from the hands of the system by reminding us of that, by effectively taking this gigantic blockbuster franchise now stripped from its original context and going, here's how it feels to be me. The Matrix has become such a behemoth within our culture to the point where it has become its own context, divorced from its origins, and that context is often lacking the human element behind its creation. How convenient for Warners who want The Matrix to be a product they can reproduce endlessly. Also, given that Don DeLillo quote is placed in and amongst the montage where Neo's colleagues figure out how best to capitalise on the prospect of a Matrix sequel, I think on some level Lana Wachowski feels partly responsible for creating the world that we now live in, at least in terms of how a thing that she made, which she put a lot of herself in, has become such a huge staple in cinema and popular culture, that we're all caught in her Matrix, so to speak, and that part of the goal here is to jog people out of that.
But it becomes a problem when fantasies endanger us or other people. We don't want anyone to get hurt, do we, Thomas?
That humanism, though, is easily my favourite aspect of the series. For all its innovation as a pioneer of digital filmmaking, pushing at the boundaries of possibility, stylism, and cool, dry philosophical dialogues, there is and always has been a deeply humanist streak running through it, something which its derivatives still have trouble grasping. Neo's story matters because of him reclaiming his personal agency from the clutches of the system. That's why he gets to be a superhero in a world of artifice and boundaries. I mean, this aspect of The Matrix goes entirely unmentioned in the pitch meeting with the game developers, specifically because it's going to be the centre of the rest of the movie, and it also works as a criticism of the outside conversation surrounding the series, that the human element often goes overlooked in certain circles. So as a result, the innovation here is to bring that humanism front and centre, as the film is more overtly personal, more sincere and whimsical, and a lot funnier in a broader way. Most crucially, it re-centres the love story between Neo and Trinity, which had always been a major part of the series but is now the very thing underpinning the plot. A bold move in and of itself, given how Neo and Trinity's romance was a much criticised aspect of the middle sequels for being uninteresting. Trinity was Neo's first point of contact in escaping the Matrix, and it was those two who initiated their daring rescue of Morpheus from capture. Their lives are inextricably tied together, both as lovers and as mutual saviours of each other.
Trinity, I know you can hear me. I'm not letting go. I can't. I love you too damn much.
So it makes a whole bunch of sense that part of Neo's prime program that allows him to undermine the system is also in Trinity, and part of his journey to self-actualize in this movie is through her. They both fearlessly leap from the top of the skyscraper, bathed in sun, hand in hand, and they become empowered by each other's mutual faith in each other. And in another ironic twist in comparison to the original, this movie's most spectacular moment is a stunt that they did completely for real. Speaking of the human element, the overall purpose of using meta-narrative here is as a means for Lana Wachowski to speak about her own experience with this series, its legacy, and its current state. This is the crux of where a lot of my defensiveness comes from, and why the movie stuck with me in the way that it did. It's a movie that is very clearly, passionately coming from somewhere, as opposed to being willed into being by a marketing algorithm. And she could have just as easily made a movie with the same colour palette, same cinematography style, same overwrought digital effects, same choreography and slow motion bullet time effects, but she actively chose not to, because that enlightening, humanist, expansive vision underpinning the series is more important, ultimately more meaningful, than the aesthetics, memes, and tropes of the series. The Matrix Resurrections is quite possibly one of the most openly pro-auteur movies ever made, because make no mistake, the author is alive and she is here to reclaim her story.
Just remind people what a free mind can do.
I forgot. It's easy to forget.
He makes it easy.
That he does.
Warner Brothers were going forward with a fourth movie regardless of whether or not the sisters were on board for it, and so blinded by profit they allowed Lana to make one final movie, one last creative carte blanche, and she used it as her chance to make a statement, to dig down deep and pull out one last dance with the thing that made her famous, one part vandalism and one part artistic liberation. She took a huge artistic risk on this, took a leap of faith on herself, undertook a daring rescue to come back and show the mainstream what a free mind can do, having already crossed over the hill once before, and to show that even though she isn't what she used to be, she's still capable of taking big chances at a time where such things matter most. And that's admirable, regardless of whether or not she made it.
Now, these are all just my own thoughts, and they're not universal. The movie is clearly, demonstrably, not working for a great number of people. And that's fine. And if you remain unconvinced of my arguments, then that's fine too. I'm not the analyst. My job isn't to tell you how to think or feel, I promise. I feel like it's a situation where, much like the other sequels, these ideas and themes that I've discussed perhaps would have been better received or maybe more clearly understood if the underlying movie was better. The trick is to make a great movie that the audience will want to unpack. Not to mention, I personally don't appreciate meta-ness that much because I don't like it when movies remind me of Scream. But as it stands, taken on the whole, The Matrix Resurrections is, as the kids say these days, a messy bitch.
It's not quite the movie that I wanted, but it's one that I'm okay with having nonetheless. It's a movie that, through no fault of its own, lives in the shadow of its former self and is trying to make the most of it, simultaneously chasing its own tail and trying to do better, suggesting that for things to move forward, things would have to be radically different, in spite of vocal segments of the fanbase who want the complacency of trying to recapture 1999. It's a movie about how it feels to be a legendary filmmaker and everyone telling you their thoughts on the thing that you made that just seemingly came out of you. It's a movie about how it feels to be nearly 60 and have a corporation own a big piece of your personal life. It's about that very piece of your life being used to keep later generations trapped in the system as you once were. It's about being past middle age and being judged entirely on who you used to be and what you used to make. About how it's okay to not be who you once were because the world doesn't end when you do. It's about a world where we can make allies with the machines because even the machines are raging against the machines. And it's about how we can liberate ourselves and each other if we're willing to take a leap of faith together. I wouldn't have the audacity to say that it's anywhere near as good as the first movie, but I think it's a perfectly valid sequel, warts and all.
And here at the tail end, I find myself still in deep admiration of the fact that these are giant blockbuster spectacles fundamentally driven by ideas. The sisters wanted the series to be a kind of mass experiment from the word go. To what extent could you change the way that people engage with blockbuster cinema? To what extent could you alter passivity?
Movies are matrices. Movies are things you go inside and they are immersive and you are cocooned by them and they tell you what to see, what to think, what to feel. And then we thought, well, that's for us problematic. We thought that what we were trying to achieve with the story overall was a shift, the same kind of shift that happens for Neo, that Neo goes from being in this sort of cocooned and programmed world to having to participate in the construction of meaning to his life. And we're like, well, can the audience go through the three movies and experience something similar to what the main character experiences?
And at the very end of this one, supposedly the very last in the series, it outright interrogates and challenges your own complacency.
But here's the thing. The sheeple aren't going anywhere. They like my world. They don't want this sentimentality. They don't want freedom or empowerment. They want to be controlled. They crave the comfort of certainty. And that means you two, back in your pods, unconscious and alone, just like them.
And so, now that it's apparently over, what are you going to do with the experience of having seen The Matrix? You know what The Matrix is. That's not a mystery anymore. You've taken the red pill, you've seen how far the rabbit hole goes, and you understand that it is not the spoon that bends, but only yourself. What are you going to do now that you're armed with that? Are you going to think for yourself and actively create meaning in this world, or are you simply looking for another cocoon in which you will be rigidly told how to think and feel? It can only show you the door. You're the one that has to walk through it.